So as we begin, there's a couple items here that I would like to announce. These display items up here on the stage to my left are provided by Kenneth L. Yoder, or Ken. So thank you, Ken, for doing that. And I was made aware of some genealogy charts in the basement. If you haven't had a chance to look at those, you'll definitely have a chance later today. But to make a point of checking them out, they're pretty interesting. And finally, before we, move into the main program, I want to just maybe open with a word of prayer, and we'll continue then. So let's pray. Dear Lord, we thank you for the faithfulness that you have given to us and our forefathers through the ages, and I pray that as we hear stories of people in the past, that we can get glimpses of that faithfulness to them, and I pray that as we learn these things and understand that you've acted through the ages, that we can begin to understand that you are faithful to us here and now, and we can praise you for that. Be with our time together. Help us to just be able to fellowship and build friendships and connections, and just be with us as we then leave from here today, that we can have considered it a morning well spent. In Jesus' name, amen. So the speaker, David I. Miller, likely doesn't need an introduction, but if you would like to begin making your way up, I will give you the head start if you need it. Just to maybe reiterate what's here on the flap of the brochure, David I. Miller and his wife, Erma, live in London, Ohio. They have 7 grown children and 19 grandchildren and 27 great-grandchildren. Is that still accurate numbers? Or does that need updated these days? A native of Grantsville, David has maintained connections with back home since moving elsewhere in '63. He's been involved with the Historians since its founding in '84, and as an editor of its bulletin, The Historian, since the first issue of 1989. So with that, I'll turn it over to David, and you can begin. Were you sitting on this?
Did you notice that Nathan said I could begin to make my way up? And I actually made my way up before he was done talking. So that's pretty good. And I guess you deserve an explanation for my limping around all over the place. I have a condition which is described something like severe inflammation under the kneecap. And there was a certain normal activity I had done that seemed to spring that situation. Been taking some treatments, and I hope by the time of the annual meeting next week, maybe I'll be walking normally again. It may involve what they call knee surgery or knee replacement. I don't know yet if it involves that or not. But I'm glad to be here and glad for this elite audience. It's probably one of the smallest audiences we've had for quite some time in these annual meetings. That then means that it's an elite kind of audience. It's not so popular that just everybody comes, but people with special interests and so on. My approach is I have written a paper, and I'd like to present that paper. And I will do that by reading the paper. And this paper is in 6 sections. And I believe what we might just do at the end of each of the 6 sessions, stop for whatever discussion it may generate, and then proceed in that way. So for Scott up there in control of the projection, if you understand that, you'll know why I don't just keep sailing on through the way that it had been indicated. But we are looking back nearly 2 centuries. We want to know the Amish experience of 1825 to 1850. The Amish Church of the time is a historical link to the churches in the Casselman Valley today and to other churches to which people of the Casselman Valley emigrated. Locally, This includes the Old Order Amish districts and the congregations known as Mountain View, Oakdale, Maple Glen, Biddinger, Cherry Glade, and Pillar of Life. Mennonite churches that share Anabaptist roots, but not directly through Amish legacy, include Springs and Oak Grove and Glade and Meadow Mountain. Churches formed by emigration from the Casselman Valley are located in Ohio and Iowa and Illinois, and influentially in other places, including Virginia, Delaware, and Michigan. The connections are continuous from the Casselman Valley back to Germany and further back to the canton of Bern, Switzerland, and its association with the early Anabaptist movement in Zurich, Switzerland. In this chain of history, the gospel of Jesus Christ has been proclaimed in settings of Anabaptist persuasion. For some, it includes genealogical history. For all of us, regardless of family tree, it is a spiritual heritage as we attempt to roll back the curtain nearly 2 centuries. I shall be referring to the period of the study as 1825 to 50. Sometimes I will zero in on the year 1837, the midpoint of the quarter, to represent the period. Geographically, our concern is the Casselman Valley, that area between Negro Mountain and Meadow Mountain, through which the Casselman River flows north, beginning in Garrett County, Maryland, and on through Somerset County, Pennsylvania. Denominationally, our subject is the Amish Church, at a time before order was in common use as a proper noun. The term Amish Mennonite would be appropriate, especially since the new arrivals from Europe would have thought of themselves as Mennonites who follow the legacy of Jacob Ammon. But I will conveniently just use Amish in most of this presentation. Original sources for 1825 to 1850 are not abundant, but we do have documentation of some events that inform us of that period. We are told of the presence of Amish families through family lore, genealogy, and the U.S. censuses. The immigrants from Germany and the movement west have left a trail. We have record of Benedict Miller and Jonas Beachy as bishops. The agricultural history tells us of developments on the farm, including, for example, the invention of the steel moldboard plow by a blacksmith named John Deere as a harbinger of the agricultural revolution which would follow. Issues of church discipline are named in the records of ministers' meetings, including that of 1837. My effort is to see glimpses of Amish church experience in the Casselman Valley in the period of 1825 to 50 in terms of 6 categories: population, going to church, church leadership, doctrine, disciplines and practices, devotional materials. The Amish Church in the Casselman Valley was formed and grew through immigration. In 1825 to 50, there were 2 main groups of immigrants. The first group had come mostly from eastern Pennsylvania, many as children of immigrants who had settled in Berks County after arriving from Germany. They had come mostly from the Palatinate in the early and mid-1700s. They arrived in the Casselman Valley in the late 1700s and early 1800s. I shall refer to this group of Amish settlers as the first wave. The second group came mostly directly from Germany, from Hesse and Waldeck, arriving in Baltimore and going west on the National Road. They arrived in the Casselman Valley right in the period of 1825 to 50. I shall refer to this group as the second wave. These two groups shared the same or similar European background, church, and language. But as immigrants in the Casselman Valley, they differed in specific ways. They differed in the German locality from which they came, their time of arrival, to some degree, location of settlement in the valley. By the year 1837, the first wave had been in America for much of a century and had lived in the Casselman Valley for nearly half a century. The second wave had just arrived and was arriving. The first wave included grandchildren of immigrants, many of them born in the Casselman Valley. The second wave consisted of first-generation immigrants who were helped by the first wave. The two groups differed also in surnames. Names among the first wave when they arrived in the late 1700s: Beachy, Bigley, Bontrager, Christner, Fike, Falk, Forney, Nagy, Hirschberger, Hostetler, Keim, Livengood, Mast, Miller, Olinger, Rhodes, Saylor, Schrock, Stutzman, Yoder, and Zook. Names of the second wave: Baumann, Beitzel, Bender, Brenneman, Esch, Gingrich, Gortner, Helmuth, Kemp, Kinzinger, Opel, Orendorf, Otto, Petersheim, Slayball, Scheyenbeck, Selder, Shelter, Stavanis, Summe, Schwartzentruber, Theis, and Jutzi. I have found no overlap of surnames between the two groups. Concerning location of the two groups within the Casselman Valley, note the red wiggled line on the map represents Casselman River. The first wave immigrants settled from Mysdale south to the Pennsylvania-Maryland line, though one family did live south of the border for a few years. The second wave then tended to push south from Grantsville to and beyond the headwaters of the river to Bittinger and Accident, and southeast to New Germany. However, in the push south, second wavers often were accompanied by first wavers, sometimes in marriage. While the differences we have noted between the two groups were real enough, there is evidence of melding of the two groups of immigrants. Later arrivals were aided with lodging by those of earlier residents. Some first wavers sold land to second wavers. About half of the 42 weddings during the period were cross-wave. The second wave immigrants found their way into the existing Amish congregation that had been functioning for nearly half a century, and many of its members having been born in the Casselman Valley. Historian Peyton Yoder noted that in the various Amish communities in America, older and newer immigrants living among each other did not always fuse easily. But in regard to the Casselman Valley, Peyton observed, in Somerset County, Pennsylvania, the Brennemans, the Gingriches, the Orndorfs, the Beitzels, and the Benders were warmly welcomed and assisted by the native-born Amish of that region. I checked Peyton's notes to find the source of that observation. I found that in February of 1988, he was in communication with Ivan J. Miller. I was pleased to read my father's perception of the matter in Peyton's Tradition and Transition. The statistics compiled by James L. Yoder of Amish, hey, that's Jim Yoder, by the way, of Amish and of the population of the Casselman Valley, show a population of 224 in 1820, 508 in 1850. Among these, some may have belonged to the Mennonite, the Brethren, and other congregations, requiring a subtraction, and an estimated Amish population in 1820 of over 200 persons, and in 1850 of over 400 persons. Of those numbers, some were born in America, and by 1850, others were fresh from Germany. But they spoke the same German dialect, had the same German literature and beliefs, and now in America, they belong to the same congregation. Now, before proceeding to the next subheading here of going to church, that is what I have to offer on population, and I'd just like to pause here for your comments, your questions, your discussion. And Bernard has the microphone for you, if you'll just raise your hand and proceed from there.
You mentioned the first wave and the second wave didn't always meld easily. Can you expound on that?
All right. Well, there are situations other than here. Example, Butler County, Ohio. I should say that not all the Amish immigrants stopped off here. There, a rather small percentage landed here, and many others went on farther west of that second wave. The Butler County, Ohio was one, and northern Illinois another, and some went directly to Ohio, where others had gone earlier. In Butler County, they had attempted to do what happened here, that the first and second wave were gathered into one congregation. In Butler County, after a few years, they formed separate congregations. The newcomers were just, I guess you might say, too liberal to be fused with those who already were settled there. The newcomers, they brought a piano with them, for example, and I don't know just what the other issues were. So that's basically what happened in other places, but apparently that did not happen here. Whether there's any undercurrent that expressed itself later, I'm not sure about that. Whether the later dissatisfactions that happened late in the 1800s, I haven't studied to see how much of that dissatisfaction came from which wave, but I'm suspicious it was probably quite, the two waves were well united by the time the division happened here in 1895. All right, let's proceed with the section, excuse me.
Just a quick question here. If I understood correctly, the first wave came from Switzerland, was that right?
No, they came from Germany. They were
Okay.
Swiss people mostly who had migrated from Switzerland to escape persecution there to Germany. And so many of them were in the Palatinate, sort of through Holland, but at any rate, by the time they came here, the first wave was mostly from the Palatinate, Germany. There were very few that came directly from Switzerland, as I understand it, but they were Swiss people.
Okay, thank you.
All right, proceeding with the section on going to church. How did the Amish experience congregational life in those decades? How did they manage to meet for church services? We must consider their geography, their roads, their mode of travel, and frequency of meeting. This congregation was known as the Revagemeinde, the river church, in the early literature. As we have noted, their homes were spread from Myersdale to Bittinger and beyond, and some families were located outside the Cassleman watershed in New Germany and Accident. By 1850, Daniel and Elizabeth Beachy, for example, lived south of Accident. The distance between Myersdale and accident by present-day roads is about 25 miles. Today, with improved roads and faster horses, a trip by horse and buggy from accident to Myersdale may take about 3 hours. After talking with Benny C. Yoder last night, maybe not quite that long. But the roads and the vehicles of 1837 may have required double that time, and in winter weather, even more time. We wish for more definite information about local road conditions in 1837 in the Casselman Valley. We do have general information. Roads were built from east to west for military and commercial purposes and for westward expansion. Examples include Forbes Road and Turkey Foot Trail and the National Road. These roads had the resources of the federal government and or the military, but the local roads were maintained or not maintained locally. According to one writer, local roads in Elk Lick Township were poorly constructed and poorly maintained in the 1800s and were impassable in bad weather. Bridges were poorly constructed, and many streams had no bridges. Here's a description of the roads throughout Pennsylvania in the early 1800s. I'm quoting now. In most cases, it was not accurate to say that a road was built between two settlements, but rather that a road was opened. Most of the early road construction operations consisted of what we would consider simply right-of-way clearance, that is, cutting of the trees and bushes and grubbing out the stumps wide enough to permit the passage of a wagon or coach, with occasional turnouts for passing. A little digging was done on the sides of the hills, and crude little bridges were constructed across streams. Paving materials, such as we know them today, were non-existent. Little effort was made to avoid steep inclines, and culverts were practically unknown. End of quote. This description of Pennsylvania roads may be true of the Casselman Valley roads at the time. Alvin J. Miller, back in the 1960s, spoke here at Maple Glen on the history of the Amish Mennonite Church of the Casselman Valley. He noted that the problem of travel from Grantsville to the Forks, that is the Cherry Glade area, beyond Bittinger, in the 1800s, he referred to the road from Grantsville south, that is present-day Route 495. He described the route as it was then, quote, by the Casselman Valley, Ridgely Hill, and the Dunghill Church, as often flooded and stormy. So, said Alvin, Bishop Joel Beachy explored a new road to be opened from Route 40 at a point 2 miles west of Grantsville and leading south along the eastern slope of Negro Mountain. The new road, said Alvin, was well sheltered from storms, almost free from snowdrifts and floods, fairly level most of the way. This new route to the Amish Cherry Glade Church area became known as Amish Road and is so called today. But even the Amish Road, when built in the late 1800s, would have consisted only of natural materials such as earth and broken stones, and the work was largely handwork. In 1837, the typical country road in the Casselman Valley would not have lent itself to a horse hitched to a buggy, trotting down the road at 10 miles per hour. By what means did the people of the Casselman Valley go from place to place in 1837? Alvin J. Miller sheds light on the mode of travel in the later 1800s. His description is instructive of the earlier decades also. In speaking of going to church, In speaking of going to church services, Alvin noted, people usually traveled on horseback. He refers to the later 1800s as a time before buggies had come into general use, and then the buggy came along. He notes that Bishop Joel Beachy and later Bishop Joel J. Miller made the trip of 12 or 13 miles to the Cherry Glade area from Grantsville on horseback. The history of the buggy as not in general use in the earlier 1800s is reflected in a gram which we'll be showing here now as used in literature. This program, the N-gram viewer, examines word usage as found in a huge body of books. This chart for the word buggy shows very low usage in 1837. Later in the 1800s, the roads were improved, the buggy came into general use, and the chart shows a much higher level of occurrence of the word, especially by 1910. With the debut of the automobile in the early 1900s, the occurrence of buggy in the books diminishes. In recent decades, the buggy is given more attention, perhaps due to popular growing interest in the Amish way of life and the appearance of new kinds of buggies such as dune buggies. Going back to Benedict Miller's estate in 1837, it is not surprising that a buggy is not included in the inventory and public sale sheets. Benedict did have wheeled vehicles, including a wheelbarrow, a cart, and a wagon, but apparently not a buggy. Wheeled vehicles had been used for a long time before this period, but the stories of transportation, the farmer's inventory, and the use of the word buggy suggests that the lightweight buggy and the carriage designed to be hitched to a fleet-footed horse and for transporting humans, not agricultural and commercial cargo, apparently was not yet in common use in the rural pioneer areas of America in 1837. We have noted the scattered geography of the Amish people of the Casselman Valley in a year such as 1837, the road conditions and their means of travel. In those conditions, how often were church services held, and how frequently did the typical family attend? Regarding church services in the Forks, Cherry Glade area, here are quotes from Alvin J. Miller. Quote, church once a month. Quote, once a month in heat or cold, rain or snow, Bishop Joel Beachy made the 24 to 25 mile round trip. Later, Joel J. Miller took over the monthly trips on horseback. Quote, each section had church services only once a month. These statements support the idea of a church service once a month in the Bittinger accident area and once a month in the Grantsville-Myersdale area. This means that an Amish church service was held every 2 weeks in the Casselman Valley, alternating between Bittinger accident and Myersdale, Grantsville. With travel mostly limited to walking or horseback on the small country roads, some families may have attended church services once a month as a rule. Where did they meet? It is well known that the Amish River Church did not have meeting houses until 1881. They met in homes. If all of the 400 plus Amish people of the Casselman Valley showed up at the same time and place for a church service, where were the homes that could have accommodated them? In the early years of the settlement, the typical first homes of the immigrants were log cabins. But sawmills were built very early, very soon and increasingly, houses were framed. The U.S. Census of Elk Lick Township shows a comparison of cabins and houses in the years 1820, 1830, and 1840. We note that the number of cabins increased from the years 1820 to 1830, but did not increase from the years 1830 to 1840. Houses, however, steadily increased in each of those decades, going from 113 to 151 to 174. By 1840, 84% of the homes in Elk Lick Township were classified as house rather than as cabin. If the cabin house statistics of the general population represent the Amish people also, many were living not in log cabins but in houses built of sawn lumber by 1840. The Abraham Beachy house, just south of West Salisbury, is an example of a commodious situation. Built in 1809, the house was occupied by Amish members of the Beachy family during the period of this study. John Hostetler built a house of sawn lumber in 1805. He referred to it in his will as a little house, implying a larger house on the farm. Benedict Miller's house of 1835, now located in Spruce Forest Artisan Village in Grantsville, could have been a place of church services along with the older farmhouse. Apparently, several homes in the Amish community were capable of accommodating sizable church services. It is doubtful, however, that the entire congregation usually met at the same time at the same place. More typical may have been a pattern of attendance for a family on those monthly occasions of a service in its own north or south area of the river church. In the absence of descriptions of the Amish church service specific to 1825 to 1850, we must rely on what is known of earlier and later patterns. This includes church services with congregational singing, scripture reading, prayer, preaching, and ministerial testimonies, the Zeugnis. The congregation sang from the Ausbund, the German Anabaptist hymnal first published in 1564. Susanna Petersheim received this in 1847, the year before her baptism. Since it is documented that the River Church replaced the Ausbund with a smaller hymn book in about 1878, it is clear the Ausbund was the book in use before then. In the church service, scripture reading followed a list of references distributed among the churches. Joel J. Miller copied a list of Gemeinschriften, church scriptures, from the Joel Beachy materials on December 5, 1898. We may assume that Joel Beachy had received the same list from his bishop predecessors, the Jonas Beachy and Benedict Miller, and that a similar list was in use in the period of 1825 to 50. A pattern of preaching as maintained by the local Old Order Amish churches in the area today may be visualized for 1825 to 50. The primary sermon text is taken from the scriptures listed for the church service of the particular Sunday. The preachers did not stand behind a pulpit, but perhaps by a table. When the meeting houses were built in 1881, new tables were built in that same year, at least for Niverton and Maple Glen. We lack evidence of a table provided for the ministers when services were held in the homes in 1825 to 50. The preacher spoke without notes, a feature representing dependence on previous study of the Word and the Holy Spirit. 2 sermons are standard in an Amish service. The first, the Anfang, 20 or 30 minutes in length, and the main sermon, which may have been an hour in length. The main sermon is followed by response of the other ministers. This time of Zeugnis or Zeugnis, testimony, may have supported the sermon just heard, and possible further admonition. A church service may extend from 9 a.m. to noon, a 3-hour service. On special occasions, such as communion, the service extends into the afternoon, with individuals and families recessing for lunch as the service continues. We will pause here now before we go to the next section for discussion on going to church. Your comments, your corrections, your questions, your discussion.
Maybe the record is quiet on this, but when the buggy was coming around in the early 1800s, was there any sort of generational, or was there any demographics that were resisting adoption of the buggy? And was there a divide on the topic of the buggy, or was it kind of adopted across the board and supported?
I am not aware of resistance to the buggy. There was, in the late 1800s, a movement throughout the country called Better Roads, a big movement, and then roads got better in many places in response to that movement. And also, if you think of it, it takes a lot of engineering to make a good buggy. I've never made one, but if you think of that buggy with those fine spindles and with the tire on it, whether it's metal or rubber, whatever it is, and designed specifically to carry people, not other stuff. There's engineering involved, and eventually they start turning them out in the factories, understand. In the late 1800s, I think, is when that mostly happened. There was, however, concern expressed about being fancy or about decorative things on a vehicle. That was concerned, but I haven't learned of any resistance to the buggy per se.
As far as the Sunday morning service, I assume the farm chores were done. Did they have breakfast before they came? Did they have a break during church? And what did they do for lunch?
During that long service, I believe that what they did for lunch, I have observed this, I think, once in attendance at the Narveton Old Order Church, as well as what they tell me, is that people, families simply excuse themselves from the service and go out perhaps to the buggy and have their lunch there and then come back in again. I don't think there's any schedule as to who goes when. They just sort of instinctively know when's a good time for us to go, and so that family goes. I take it that the dad probably takes the lead and the others follow then. And so that's done in a well-understood way and very orderly, but you do miss some of the preaching in the process of doing that. There's a hand back here a little while ago, I think.
Early on, or earlier, as a technical question, you showed a farm building, I believe, near Salisbury. Can you be more specific about where that is, actually?
Is it the house at West Salisbury? There's a stone house.
That one.
Yeah, that is a house. That, if you are in West Salisbury and you want to go to Springs, within a half mile, that house is on the right. and it is the Abraham Beachy house. Abraham was a son of Peter Beachy the first, a brother of Peter Beachy the second, and they were, that was an Amish family. And then his son, I think Peter Beachy the third. Am I correct on this? Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. It was, and those, each of those generations was a small family, and they were Amish for 2 or 3 generations. And it's still in the Amish family, still in that Beachy family, handed down. So next time you go down the road from Grantsville from Springs to West Salisbury, just notice that place. And it was built, what did I say, 1808, I believe. It looks like a really expensive house, but understand, you know where the stones came from? Right off the fields. So it must have been labor intensive to build a stone house, but not necessarily monetarily expensive, I would think. So that house still stands. I'm not sure if it's the main residence anymore, but it's still in the Beachy family. Was there another hand a while ago that wasn't answered yet? Anybody else? Well, we can move on now to the next section on church leadership. The River congregation was well supplied with pastoral leadership in 1825 to 50. The pattern of plural ministry called for the congregation to have a bishop, 1 or more ministers, and in many cases a deacon. The ministerial team was supplied primarily by the church calling one of its own men to the ordained ministry. Also, there were cases of ordained ministers moving into the area and joining the team. 3 ministers of the River congregation were listed as in attendance at a meeting in the Glades, Berlin, in 1837. Benedict Miller, Jost Yoder, and John Gingrich. Additionally, Henry Hostetler was a deacon, likely before he moved to Ohio in 1832. Jacob Schwartzentruber moved from the Glades to Berlin, from the Glades at Berlin to the Casselman Valley in 1840. Jonas Beachy was ordained as a minister during the time of this study and at least by 1843 as bishop to succeed Benedict Miller. John C. Nagy is designated as a minister in the genealogies. He lived in Elk Lick Township in 1850, then 36 years of age with a family of 6 young children. His obituary records his death in Indiana in 1889 and his ordination about 52 years earlier in Somerset County. This places his ordination back to 1837 with John at about the age of 21. Was he perhaps ordained then because of the vacancy on the preacher's bench when Benedict died? Daniel Hirschberger and Jacob Brenneman were ministers. Whether ordained before or after 1850, we do not know. The list of ministers in the River Church during the period of 1825 to 50 testifies to an active ministerial leadership during that time. We have limited access to the personal joys and stresses of the ministers who preached the sermons, officiated the ordinances and the weddings, and administered in matters of church discipline. But we have a telling comment from Jacob Schwartzentruber, whose migration took him from Germany to Somerset County, to Garrett County, to Iowa. Jacob's keen sense of burden as bishop in Iowa is expressed in a letter of 1866. Quoting Jacob, "I often felt unworthy to stand before the congregation, but my calling required it. I have been in the ministry now for 40 years. In my weakness, Armut, of 33 years in America, 7 in the Glades congregation, 11 years on the river, that's the Casselman River. I was present when Benedict Miller died, a minister of integrity, and so then I was with Jonas Beachy. I have seen that these ministers were criticized by ungrateful church members. So as best as I can think back, it goes with all ministers. And it is no wonder that that is my experience in my weakness. A more positive comment about the Amish Church of the period is offered by letter writer Christian Yutzi. He arrived in Baltimore from Germany in 1833 as a widower. He then lived with his sons, including extended stays with Peter and Lydia Beachy Yutzi, whose farm was located less than a mile southeast of Springs, where the road circles around the barn. Your local people might recognize that. Known decades ago as a Coley Bender place. I don't know what it is called anymore now today. Lydia, Peter's wife, was a daughter of Peter Beachy II, from whom their own farm was annexed. Letter writer Christian Yutzi lived here during much of his time in America from 1833 till his death in 1845. The farm was situated between and joined the farms of Benedict Miller and Jonas Beachy. The letter writer had occasion to know both bishops as neighbors and would have attended the River Church, where both Benedict and Jonas served as bishop. In a letter written to a nephew in Butler County, Ohio, Christian Yutzi mourned a conflict in the Amish Church in Butler County. He then described his experience in the church in Somerset County. Peter Yutzi wrote, quote, "Here there are 3 congregations not far from one another, the Conomo congregation, the upper, that is the Casselman River, and the glades exist all the time in peace and unity." We can only wonder how Benedict Miller and Jonas Beachy would have expressed themselves on the matter if they had written with a sanguinity expressed by Jacob Schwartzentruber. And a discussion on church leadership. I don't know if the water's muddy or if it's that clear that you don't have anything more to say. Well, that's all right. And so we'll move on to the next section on doctrine. In regard to Amish doctrine, if Jacob Ammon was asked about the doctrine of the church that came to be known as Amish, he could have said, "Here are the 18 articles." If Jacob Hertzler, the first Amish bishop in America, was asked the same question, he could have replied, "See the 18 articles." Benedict Miller and Jonas Beachy could have given the same answer with confidence. The Dordrecht Confession is an important statement of Amish doctrine. It was written by Mennonites in Dordrecht, Holland in 1632. It was adopted by the movement later known as Amish in a meeting of 13 Swiss ministers in Onenheim in the Alsace in 1660. That was more than 30 years before the former Reist-Ammon division. As a doctrinal expression, it flows through Amish history like a continuous thread. It is used today by the Order Amish churches for doctrinal reference, including instruction for baptism. The Dordrecht Confession is an evangelical expression in the sense of historic evangelicalism. This is suggested by the titles of some of the articles: God and the creation of all things, the fall of man, the restoration of man through Christ, the advent of Christ into the world. And Articles 3 and 4, the sacrificial and redemptive work of Christ Jesus is treated in those articles. The Dordrecht Confession is Anabaptist also. In contrast to the state church system of Europe, the confession emphasizes the New Testament beyond the Old Testament as the whole counsel and will of God. Baptism for penitent believers who through faith, the new birth and renewal of the Holy Spirit have become united with God, in contrast to infant baptism for all who live in the territory. The church, consisting of those who have truly repented and rightly believed, not consisting of all who live in the territory. Excommunication of church members who, after admonition, live in deliberate sin, thus not providing continued membership for liturgical conveyance of grace. Marriage between a believing man and a believing woman who belong to the same church and doctrine. Recognition, respect, and prayer for the government as God's servant. Non-participation in governmental sword-wielding functions. Non-swearing of oaths. Yet a word about shunning. Article 17 in Dordrecht. The shunning of those who are expelled was taken seriously by the early Amish practice. It meant avoidance in social life for the purpose of restoration. New Testament references are cited as a basis for the position. 1 Corinthians 5, 5 and 6, and chapter 12, and 1 Timothy 5:20, 2 Corinthians 13:10. This position was not held by all Anabaptists, but was taught by men of Simons, and was a point of contention in the so-called Reist-Ammon division. In a conference in the Palatinate in 1779, shunning is applied to those who, quote, leave the truth of the gospel and the church, end quote. In 1809, the Amish ministers of eastern Pennsylvania, Mifflin County, and Somerset County reiterated that shunning is for those members who leave us and join themselves to other churches. Again, in 1837, in the middle of this period, the period of this study, the Somerset County Amish ministers, including those of the River Church, stated, separation and shunning are to be practiced toward all disobedient ones. In attendance in this meeting were Benedict Miller, Yost Yoder, and John or Hans Gingrich of the River Church. This and other parts of the 1837 resolutions represent a resolve by the leaders of the River Church in 1837 to adhere to the legacy of earlier Amish doctrinal statements. This refers not only to shunning, but to other tenets as well. So that is the section of what I have to present on discipline and practice. Is there questions or comments on that one?
Don't know that I have exactly questions on that, other than I was wondering, when was there more than one district, or what point was there more than one district in the Amish church here?
It happened first in, I think it was 1878, real close to that, when they apparently decided it's too much to keep one church together. So they formed two congregations, and one congregation was in Maryland, the other Pennsylvania. The Mason-Dixon line was a line between the two. You didn't cross the line because you like the other preacher better. So that was the first, that there were two congregations, and that was a completely peaceable dividing. It was not based on differences. And so the church continued on that basis. Each church had its own bishop, Maryland and Pennsylvania, but they were interacting in a way. When it came to building church houses, I don't think the one who built church houses without the other agreeing also. So they interact in that way. But then differences did arise, and it was 1895 then where there was a schism, a division, where the one Amish Mennonite church then became identified as Old Order Amish Mennonite. That was the Pennsylvania church, and the other, the Maryland church, as Conservative Amish Mennonite. However, better not take time to go into more detail, except to say that the Maryland church had Pennsylvania members, and the Pennsylvania church had Maryland members. You crossed the line then as you chose your church affiliation between the two. Mm-hmm.
Am I right that in the very early years, at least in the area, there were union churches because there weren't enough people to have varying denominational churches or whatever? So there were union churches that that people of different faith backgrounds attended the same church. Were there Amish that would have attended those churches in the early years, or did the Amish always have their own churches? That's the first question, I guess.
Mm-hmm. My impression would be that they had their own churches. I don't think there was any official participation in union churches. Whether some Amish people attended those services, I would have no way of saying that they did or did not. I don't really know what happened there. I might add this, that it's my impression during this period of 1825 to 50 that the Amish church did not lose very many members to other churches. I think there's so much excitement going on with people coming in from Germany and people going on west, and that's sort of a time of getting consolidated. And there was an earlier time back before 1800, in the late 1700s, when the Amish church lost many members, especially to the Brethren, and a few to the Mennonites. But the Mennonite church during this period did not have a local pastor. And even as late as 1850, they had, I think, 23 members in the Mennonite church. And so the Mennonite history is one of a struggling small group until about 1850, when they got a local pastor, and then things began to happen in the Mennonite church. And from that period on, there would have been more migration, that's not the right word, but change of affiliation of Amish people to Mennonite in those later years, but probably not 18. There might have been some, but I don't think it was much.
Well, that might answer my the follow-on question that I had then, because I was wondering if I understood you correctly, when discipline, shunning, was to be applied to people who left the Amish church, even if they went to other churches.
Yes,
is that
right,
correct? And so I was wondering, because I thought that there was some marriage, at least in and out of the Amish church, and I wondered about those who married out of the Amish church, if that also applied to them. But perhaps during this time that wasn't an issue.
You see, when they married outside of the...
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
Well, one of the things they spoke of in 1837 was that if somebody marries one who is not Amish, was it 1809 or 1837? They said that no longer shall we receive that other marriage partner. How shall I say this? At least they would not receive one marriage partner without the other. But later in the 1800s, there are just quite a number of Amish people that married non-Amish, and some brought them into the Amish fellowship and others did not. And I know that there were those marriages even in my memory, in my very young days, where the one partner would come to church here and the other would not. There were a few cases like that at that time. But their effort was not to have that happen, but I'm not sure how successful that was.
I have two questions. One is the 1837 meeting, what was that? What brought that about? And the other one was, I think there was a conference sort of churchwide among the Amish in the early 1830s. Was Somerset County involved in that? So there's kind of two questions there.
Yeah. The 1830s had to do, I think what you have referenced there was, the question then was, if a Mennonite wants to join the Amish Church, do we have to rebaptize him? Does he need to be baptized by an Amish bishop? And so that was a very difficult question, where the Eastern Amish ministers were saying we need to rebaptize, and the Ohio people on the frontier did not. In fact, they had violated the convictions of the Eastern Amish by accepting a Mennonite without rebaptizing him. And I don't think that had a, I'll come to that in the next section then, but I don't think that had a great effect on the congregation here. I don't think it became a real life question here. The 1837 one, I'll be talking more about that one. So talking about, what is it we're talking about? Discipline and practice. We shall look further into the discipline of 1837. How's that? On March 18, 1837, 13 Amish ministers of the 3 Somerset County churches met to deal with various items of church polity. Of the 13, 5 were from Conemaugh, Johnstown. 5 were from Glades, Berlin. 3 from the river, Benedict Miller, Yost Yoder, Hannes Gingrich. The place of meeting is not given, but likely they met in the most central location, Berlin. The report of this meeting of 1837 lists 11 points of discipline and agreement. These points seem to represent problems of deviation from accepted practice in the churches. First on the agenda, the ordinance of God on the matter of the ban. As noted above, this doctrine is deeply rooted in Amish church history, but is stated here as greatly neglected in 1837. The matter had been given more extensive attention in the larger meeting of 1809, but needed attention again 28 years later in 1837. Simplicity and plain lifestyle were major concerns in this meeting. In regard to clothing, forbidden items included silken neckcloths or halstucher, high collars for women, and mothers allowing daughters to wear men's hats. This was at a time before the bonnet became into Amish usage in the Cassleman Valley, which occurred probably after 1850. Amish tailors were not to make new or worldly styles for members. The houses were not to have displays such as paint of various colors and showy furniture and utensils. Cabinet makers were not to make proud furniture with shekich colors. Sleighs and other vehicles were not to be painted two-tone, and excessive driving of sleighs and other vehicles was not to be. In relation to society at large and government, members were to refrain from jury duty and voting in political elections. Regarding marriage, If a member marries outside the church, no longer, and quote, no longer, shall it be the practice to bring him or her back into the church unless the marriage partner is included. I think this would have involved excommunication for having violated by marrying a non-Amish person, and then to bring him back in only if the partner comes in also into the Amish discipline. In case of a marriage where both are outside the church and they both are brought into the church, instruction shall be given on the obligations of Christian marriage. The Sabbath is to be kept holy, business conducted 6 days of the week, except in emergency. The discipline of 1837 is not given as a complete statement of Ordnung. Other aspects of practice were firmly understood. The meeting of 1837 was concerned with maintaining the disciplines of the early Amish movement of the 1600s, the disciplines of the 1700s in Europe, and the positions stated in the meeting of 1809. Here in 1837, the Somerset County Amish ministers held the pronouncement of 150 years of Amish teaching as faithful application of New Testament teaching. Yet a few observations on bundling. The practice of bundling, also known as bed courtship, has been described as a form of courtship in which the young people, fully clothed except for their shoes, occupy the same bed. Bundling did not originate with the Amish. The Puritan preacher Jonathan Edwards, who died in 1758, preached against it. Somehow it found its way into Amish society, and it seems to have been found in the various Amish congregations in America before and during the period of this discussion. Bundling was a major ministerial concern of the Somerset County ministers in their meeting of 1837. The resolution on bundling was a resounding prohibition. Solchen soll gar nicht geduldet werden. Such things shall not be tolerated at all. But apparently, bundling was practiced among the youth of the River Church. The introductory lines of the resolution imply as much, stating, with regard to excesses practiced among the youth, namely that the youth take liberty to sleep or lie together. The River Church, in collaboration with the other Somerset County churches, attempted to eliminate this practice, but apparently had not reached that goal in 1837. Jacob Schwartzentruber, who had ministered in the River congregation before moving to Iowa in 1851, was a major voice against bundling among the Amish. His grandson, Jacob F. Schwartzentruber, notes that bundling was the main reason for his grandfather moving from Grantsville to Iowa. Jacob F. wrote, quoting, "Bundling was the main reason for my grandfather leaving his beloved home in Allegheny County, before formation of Garrett County, and going to the far west of Johnson County, Iowa, where he founded a church where this blot, this Schandfleck, was not tolerated, nicht gebilligt, as one of the first such churches in America." In various Amish ministers' meetings in America during the 18th and 19th century, bundling was condemned and announced as forbidden. But the practice seems to have persisted in some areas, even supported by some church leaders who honored it as a tradition. In the River Church, bundling seems to have been fully abandoned later in the 1800s, sometime before the division of 1895. An issue not mentioned in the disciplines of 1809 and 1837 is the production and use of alcoholic beverages. Various Amish-owned farms had distilleries in the 19th century. At the estate sale of Benedict Miller in 1838, a distillery was among the higher-priced items of the day. Christian Yutzi wrote about the distillery of his son Daniel Yutzi in a letter of 1835. He wrote, quoting Christian Yutzi, "Daniel has rented a distillery for 7 years. All equipment for distilling belongs to Daniel and is in daily operation. 6 bushels of grain have the equivalent weight of 360 pounds, and this produces 22 to 23 gallons of whiskey. A gallon sells for 40 cents here. It is not advisable to grow corn and wheat here. Corn here brings 62 cents, and Daniel has so much of it in stock that he can't use it all up this year. His whiskey sells well." Christian may have implied that Daniel, instead of growing wheat and corn, should grow more rye for distilling. One historian gives the following economic advantage of turning grain into whiskey. A horse could carry 4 bushels of grain, but he could take the product of 24 bushels in the form of whiskey. Whiskey was therefore the most convenient and important article exchanged for necessities such as salt, sugar, and iron. And we need to picture this horse carrying this much grain in the form of whiskey as going from here to places like Baltimore along the National Pike, or maybe to Philadelphia for marketing their farm products. Whiskey was a common amenity in the fields at harvest time. But David Livengood, a German Baptist, and John Ingle, a Reformed man, were among the first of the farmers in Elk Lick to banish liquor from their fields, according to historian Welfley. Ingle was a father-in-law of Amish minister Jacob D. Brenneman. Welfley reports further, "From and after 1835, a strong feeling against this pernicious custom began to grow among the better class of farmers all over the county, and many of them banished the jug from their farms." We have this interesting insight that the damage of alcohol consumption was recognized in Elk Lick Township by 1835. The American Temperance Society was formed in 1826 and apparently soon brought its influence to the Casselman Valley. This was long in advance of the United States constitutional prohibition that endured from 1920 to 1933. Where does this leave the Amish River Church in the years such as 1837 in regard to the production and use of alcoholic beverages? We can note, first, strong drink had a dominant place in German culture. Whiskey was used often in folklore medicine. Distilleries were a common and economic feature on the farms in the period of this study, including Amish farms. The question of production and use of alcohol was not included in the disciplines of 1809 and 1837. While using alcohol may not have led to drunkenness in most cases, some cases of alcoholism did occur among the Amish. These observations support a conclusion that the Amish River Church of 1837 accepted the use of alcohol for refreshment and likely also as medicine, but denounced drunkenness and did not see production of strong drink as inconsistent with Christian ethics. Temperance movements and a few cases of addiction may have contributed to concern about alcohol consumption and conviction for abstinence. Later, perceptively before 1895, the Amish Church of the Casselman Valley came to a position of abstinence, except in case of prescription by a physician, as an appropriate response of Christian ethics. I might add that I make the point of conviction for abstinence from alcohol before 1895. Testimony to that is the local order Amish Church not being given to consumption, its people not being given to consuming alcohol, in contrast to some other areas where it is a common usage. And the same thing would apply to the use of tobacco too, where we have an order Amish Church here that is clean of those practices. And it seems to me that this whole thing was cleared up pretty much before 1895. Any other comments, questions on right here?
Last evening, I noted that the census of Somerset County, 1840 and 50, said there was no wine produced in the county. Is that because whiskey is not considered wine, or how do we account for that?
Oh, how about that? I'm not real well versed on the various beverages, and whiskey and wine certainly not the same thing. And I don't think wine is what these people were producing. Wine is more of a grape product, I believe, and I don't think we had vineyards that much here. So if that statistic has to do with wine, I'm not sure how to relate the two. Yeah, but I found that very interesting there. I wonder had they tried vineyards and gave up, and that's why they quit producing wine. Anybody else have any insight on that?
Well, I would just suppose that maybe the difference is that the wine is a grape product and the whiskey was a grain product.
I think that's true. In fact, I think they also used apples some for the production of whiskey. Mm-hmm. Well, let's look at devotional materials. Amish church life in the early 1800s was more than mere adherence to certain doctrines and practices. We find signals of devotion and worship represented by literature known to have been in Amish homes. Benedict Miller bought a large Bible in 1829. He paid $10 for that Bible. $244 in today's money. Benedict's son Joel B. bought that Bible at Benedict's estate sale in 1838 for $9.81. On December 14, 1836, 6 months before his death, Benedict wrote on the page at the end of the New Testament, "Habe ich die Bibel zum dreimal durchgelesen." Have read this Bible through 3 times. The Bible may be considered at the top of the list of literature in Amish homes, but there were other books. 65 books were sold at Benedict's estate sale in 1838. The books were sold one by one, each at its own price. From the inventory submitted to the court, we learned that the books included 3 German Bibles, 1 English Bible, 1 German martyr book, 1 Life of Christ, 2 Dietrich Phillips books. Unfortunately, the inventory and the sales sheets do not list the titles of the other 57 books. Such a list likely would include titles that were commonly found in Amish families in the 1800s, such as Martyr's Mirror, for example. Published first in Holland in 1660, many editions followed. This tome of over 1,000 pages was translated from Dutch to German and printed by the Ephrata Cloister as early as 1749. The Martyr's Book was the highest priced book at the sale, bought by Jonas Beachy. Dordrecht Confession was an important source of instruction in the doctrines of the Church. The writings of Menno Simons, Dirk Phillips, were held in high regard and show up occasionally in the wills of Amish testators. Geistliches Lustgottlein had come into use in the Amish homes already before 1800s. The title conveys the idea of a small spiritual garden of pleasure. Published first in 1727, this book gives guidelines for Christian living and includes prayers for personal devotional experience. Carl Westmeyer noted that this book was of pietistic source, but that the Anabaptists took to it like fish to water. Ernsthafte Christenpflicht is a prayer book with a title that refers to the duty of earnest Christians, a 1739 publication of the Swiss Mennonites of the Palatinate. This volume presents prayers for both home and church, for personal and family use, and for church occasions. Though of Mennonite origin, a significant number of prayers of pietistic origin are included from Geistliches Lustgottlein. Ernsthafte Christenpflicht is in use yet today among the Amish, published by Pathway Publishers or printers of Ontario. Goldene Äpfel in Silberschalen, gold apples in silver bowls, is an Anabaptist devotional title published in 1702. It includes writings by Anabaptist martyrs, prayers, and a version of the Dordrecht Confession. One copy of this book, published in 1742 in Germany, was brought nearly a century later to Casselman Valley by 19-year-old immigrant Maria Schwartzentruber in 1833. Maria may have been the only member of her immediate family to migrate to America. Later, the book came into possession of Bishop Joel J. Miller. I am pleased to have it in my possession now. The Ausbund was a hymnal of the River Congregation in the early 1800s. This hymnal includes songs of praise and worship, expressions of Christian experience, admonitions concerning the Christian life, and poetic narratives that tell of persecution and suffering. The Ausbund continues in use by a vast array of Amish congregations of North America today. Reportedly, even now, 10,000 Ausbunds are printed every year. So I will pause before I go into conclusion for any discussion on the Amish literature of the period. As you can tell, I sort of drew on what likely almost had to be there in the various Amish homes, not having a specific record of it. And I just regretted so much that at Benedict's sale in 1838, that the clerk didn't write every title of the 65 books that were there. I was a bit surprised, I admit, to find that many books in an Amish home back in that period when making books wasn't what it is now. They weren't turning out a lot of paperbacks like we're doing now. In conclusion, while many unanswered questions can be asked, we can assign to the Amish River congregation of 1825 to 50 characteristics such as these. Growth in numbers during the period, with a population of over 400 in about 70 households by 1850, and conceivably more than 150 baptized members. A geography that stretched from Myersdale to Accident. Many families living in houses built of sawn lumber with decreasing use of log houses. church services held bi-weekly or semi-monthly, that is, once each month in the north part of the Casselman Valley, Grantsville to Myersdale, and once each month in the south part, Biddinger Accident. Anabaptist doctrine expressed in the Dordrecht Confession of Faith and other Anabaptist literature, including the writings of Menno Simons and Dietrich Phillips, an ordnung of practice basically consistent with the early Amish movement in the days of Jacob Ammon and others, and the order Amish polity of today. Relative peace in regard to issues of church discipline, but with pastoral concern regarding elements of noncompliance. Access to devotional materials that point to God, His Word, and faithfulness in life. Some materials of pietistic origin, but accompanied by the expression of Anabaptist understanding. Well, I've had enough opportunity for discussion, perhaps. Anything more at this point? That's the end of my presentation. Back to the moderator. See if I can.
Just a comment on the previous discussion about the whiskey and the wine. And please don't consider me an expert on the subject, but it's my understanding that like the apple product and the grape product, that was a fermented drink, where the whiskey was a distilled drink, and I think probably had a much higher content of alcohol in it.
Uh-huh.
And maybe there's somebody that, you know, has a better understanding of it than what I do.
And I don't know if we have information or not on what the alcohol content was of these Amish distilleries. That I'm not informed on.
In the back of Saul Yoder's account book, he has how to make wine, and he adds that for a little extra flavor, add a quart of whiskey. So it was kind of a mixture.
Thank you, David. There's a lot of preparation that goes into presenting really anything, and it's evident that you have put a lot of work into preparing this. I think I can safely assume that we would be in agreement to maximize the discussion here and maybe what David has to present. Next on the agenda is an offering and break. Because we were able to have the Q&A and discussion kind of through his talk, I think the next presentation by David is basically now. I think maybe we'll break for 5 minutes just to have a break, and we'll reconvene here at 45 and continue through this. Yes.
David, I think David has concluded his presentation.
Okay.
For the morning. But
Okay.
check with David.
Is that
Well, that's all right.
is that the conclusion of? Do you have this presentation?